May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to God and to each of us as we think about what He might have for us today to reflect upon. I'm here today to introduce a book written by Dr. Glenn M. Wagner. What's the M stand for? Maris. And I want to say right off, in case there's any misunderstanding afterwards, that I endorse this book. Don't want any lack of clarity. But Pastor Glenn has written about God incidents in our life. And beginning this week on Wednesday night, he's got a class that's going to talk about introduction in chapter 1 this week, I think. So pick it up, review it, read it, and if you haven't got it yet, pick up a copy and become a part of that process. God incidents are those things that happen in our life where as we look back and reflect upon it, we sense God's presence in that moment. Now, the title for the sermon today comes from a Gaither tune where the writers put together the phrase, "I don't pretend to be so wise. I only know He touched my eyes, and nothing else will ever be the same." As I think about my life and the healing story today and how it changed that man's life, I know that each of us have some stories that we can tell and share, and that's part of what's going to happen in that dialogue with Pastor Glenn on Wednesday nights. One of the ones that literally changed my life was a God incident when I was a teenager. I grew up on a Jersey farm, and from everything that I understood, I was going to milk cows the rest of my life. And there were some things about milking cows that I didn't really like, but it's what I knew. And one of the things I didn't like was, after a rainy day like this, having a wet tail swept into my face. It just wasn't something I looked forward to doing. But then some incidents, or some God incidents, took place. A pastor took me under his wing and invited me to go to annual conference. And while at annual conference, on the last service of annual conference where pastors are ordained, Bishop Marshall Reed, on the invitation hymn at the end, extended an invitation to anyone who felt called to preach to come forward. That was a God incident in my life that literally changed my life, because it opened up a whole new area to me that I never truly thought in my heart was possible for me. God incidents are those that come into our life and are going to stir up controversy. Now, if you read the rest of the passage in the gospel today, you will find that the man who was born blind and who was encountered by Jesus and had his eyes touched went through a series of tests. When he came back into the community after receiving his sight, they began to question, isn't this a guy that was born blind? Well, yeah, but maybe he was never born blind. Maybe something just happened. Others began to question, who did this? And if he's such a holy man, why would he heal on the Sabbath? And there was an ongoing testing of even family members who the parents were called and said, was this your son? Was he really born blind? And did Jesus heal him? And they were put on the hot seat because if they answered incorrectly, they could get kicked out of the synagogue, and it raised all kinds of ramifications. God incidences can do that. Pastor Glenn, as he shares in his introduction, says, each chapter has been inspired by two realities that are part of life. On one hand, there is real pain and disappointment in the world that can challenge our faith in the goodness of God. On the other hand, God is seen in amazing ways God incidents inspire many to believe in God and to live in faith, despite life's challenges. This book recognizes that bad things happen, but it also demonstrates that God is still part of life. Just as a good optometrist can help a person with blurred vision with a new prescription for corrective lenses, my aim is to offer an alternative, improved perspective to those who feel cut off from God. The book helps us see better of what's going on in our life where God, very possibly, is and has been involved. There are some things in my life that I have never understood. I continued to argue with God about the death of my brother, and I'm sure God has said many times to me, come on, that's 15 years ago. Isn't it time you let that go? It happened. Someday maybe you'll understand. But he was only 65, Lord, and he was my friend, my confidant, almost like a father figure to me. There are those things that happen that are hard to understand, and we don't always see the good in those events that come our way. One of my favorite stories is an old Chinese story or proverb that goes like this. One day, a farmer lost his horse. It just ran off. The neighbors came by and said, oh, how unfortunate. And the farmer said, well, maybe. The next day, the horse returned with 3 horses. And the neighbors came by and said, how fortunate, you've gained 3 horses. And the farmer said, well, maybe. The next day, the farmer's son went out to tame one of the horses, and while trying to ride the horse, was thrown off and broke his leg. The neighbors came by and said, how unfortunate. And the farmer said, well, maybe. The next day, some military guys came by seeking to recruit people to fight in their army. And because the son had a broken leg, he could not be recruited. And the neighbors came by and said, how fortunate. And the farmer said, well, maybe. The next day, the army guys found a cousin that lived up the road from the farmer and had him drafted into the army. And the neighbors came by and said, well, how unfortunate. And the farmer said, well, maybe. The next day, the house where the cousin lived was hit with a landslide, and if he had been there, he would have been killed. And the neighbors come by and say, how fortunate. And the farmer responds, well, maybe. The story goes on and on, on and on. You get the drift. How we look at incidences in our life can vary. And for some, no matter what happens, it's bad. I had a brother-in-law like that no matter what happened, no matter who was in the presidency in the White House, it was bad. Events that took place, never seen the economy so bad. I just got used to that. That was his outlook. He was a great guy, but he just never really looked at the positive side that much. We get to choose a little bit of how we see things happening in our life. When I was a kid, I remember it really well for some reason. Just one of those little incidents. We're down at the barn milking cows, and my dad says, let's hurry it up. We're going to church tonight. It's Sunday. I said, wait a minute, I'm a Methodist. I only go once a day. And besides, you're going to some United Brethren church? And he said, yeah, there's a hymn writer that's going to be there, and I want to go hear him. So we go to this little country church near Six Lakes, Michigan. And that night, I got to hear Virgil and Blanche Brock, who wrote Beyond the Sunset. Now, it's amazing to me that I remember that. And my going was just an incident. I'm not claiming that as a God incident. But once I reread the story about the hymn Beyond the Sunset, I realized now that was a God incident. Winona Lake, Indiana, there used to be some college there in that area. I don't know if it's still there. But anyway, there was a school of music. And one Sunday afternoon, one of the faculty invited the other faculty over, and they're sitting on the deck looking over at Winona Lake. And eventually they enjoyed a sunset. And there's Virgil Brock and his wife Blanche and Virgil's cousin who was blind named Horace and a bunch of other people. And they get to talking and describing that sunset. And after a while it gets quiet and darkness descends. And the blind cousin says, "I have never seen such a beautiful sunset." And they turn to him and say, "What do you mean? You didn't see the sunset?" And he said, but you described it to me as you were talking, and the words you used, and I could envision it. And I have never seen such a beautiful description. And beyond that, I see beyond the sunset. So after they left and went home, Virgil Brock sat down and began to play with those words, beyond the sunset. And his wife went to the piano and began to play composition that might possibly go with that. And in a little time, he had written 3 verses to Beyond the Sunset. And this is in 1936. And I heard them about 10, 12 years later. But then the blind guy, Horace, the cousin, said, "Well, you know, that's good, but you didn't describe the dark clouds. Before the sunset, you were talking about it looked like it's going to storm. And there was, you know, dark clouds on the horizon." And so Virgil went back and put together another verse, and Beyond the Sunset has basically 4 verses. Now, most of us, how many are familiar with the hymn Beyond the Sunset? Okay. It never made our hymnal for some reason. But the first verse goes, "Beyond the sunset, O blissful morning, when with our Savior heaven is begun, earth's toiling ended, O glorious dawning, beyond the sunset, when day is done." That's going to be part of our postlude today. So the interesting thing about that music is periodically, during the day, I'll turn on the TV and go to the music channel, the instrumentals, and lo and behold, Beyond the Sunset is a part of that taped ministry that almost always plays at 3:30 or whatever. And I think how such an incident comes back around in my life. I've heard that hymn sung at many funerals, and it just keeps coming back. It's one of those interesting God incidences that continues to influence my life. I mentioned Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer. Back 500 years ago, in the midst of the struggle with the Catholic Church and the power in Rome, Martin was under duress. He had gone through trial. He was sent home. They didn't make a martyr out of him, but they sent him back home and said, "Don't do anything. No more writing the theology, none of that stuff. Just mind your own business." So Martin goes home and starts writing hymns. And one day he reads Psalm 46. Our God is our fortress. And lo and behold, he puts together one of the greatest hymns that's ever been written. 500 years ago. That hymn appears in almost every hymnal and even is a part of the Roman Catholic missal or hymnal today. Martin Luther would just shake his head and wonder at how God worked through events. Many years ago, another pastor, other than the one that took me to conference, said, "Eldon, if you're going to be a pastor, you need to get acquainted with church camps. I was a poor farmer kid and had to work all summer. Never got a chance to go to camp. But as a college kid, I got roped into going to camp. And the pastor said, I want you to see how important camping is. And Brendan, as you go to Lake Louise, I want you to know that I was the head dog there many years as the dean of the camp. And so you're walking on holy ground when you go to Lake Louise. But camping became a part of my life. But something else happened at that camp that just probably was a God incident. There was a young lady there that went to Central Michigan University, and she has never left my side since that day. It's just amazing how God incidences work. Finally, this is from John Harrington in Florida, so I'll give some credit. An attorney is closing up his business, and he has 17 clients that still owe him money. And he thinks about suing them. He thinks about sending out another letter with a bill, and he finally just says, it's not worth it. So he sends out 17 certified letters forgiving the debt and saying, we're free and clear. Only one person opened that letter to find the blessings that were inside. The rest simply threw them away, and their life never changed. I believe that God provides almost daily God incidents that can change and influence our life and create a history where we can look back and say, I don't pretend to be so wise. I only know that God touched my life, and nothing else has ever been the same. Amen.